Dr. Andrew Hartman, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
It is a real pleasure to be talking to you. You have in your Twitter bio, you call yourself the Chill Commie. Is that a name you gave yourself? Where'd that one come from?
No, I'm a professor of history at Illinois State University, and we're required to do have students complete course evaluations at the end of every semester. They're anonymous, and one of my students said something to the effect of, "Dr. Hartman is a commie, but he's chill, so it's all good." So I just thought that was funny. It's probably a conservative student who knew where I stood, but still enjoyed the class.
Yeah, he was like, this person's not unreasonable, but I
Yeah,
disagree with him. That's funny.
exactly.
That's funny. When did you, so you're teaching at Illinois State University, and you're a professor of history there, correct?
Correct.
When did you start getting into Marxist history in America?
Um, so I first got into Marx and Marxism. I first started reading Marx when I was a young man in my early 20s, even before I went to graduate school. But, in graduate school, I studied U.S. history and focused specifically on 20th century U.S. history. I still read Marx and consider myself a Marxist in terms of my intellectual approach. But I didn't research Marx and Marxism until I decided to write this current book, that's just out, Karl Marx in America. It took me 10 years to research and write it. It was quite an undertaking. But no, my previous works were on the history of education in the United States, and then I wrote a history of the culture wars since the 1960s. So I hadn't focused my scholarship on Marx or Marxism until this current research project.
Yeah. What influenced you to let's write a book on Marx?
Well, as I said, I'd always been intrigued by Marx, interested in Marx, a reader of Marx. When I was younger, in several Marxist reading groups. I find his thinking compelling and convincing. And but it wasn't really the focus of my scholarship, but I'd written a couple of books, I'd gotten tenure, I'd gotten promoted, and I decided that I wanted to do something that was more like a personal passion project. And nobody had written this book. There's obviously scholarship about Marxism in the United States, but nobody had looked at had traced the how Americans have thought about and written about and put Marx into action across U.S. history, really from the Civil War to the present, which is what my book is about.
Is the Civil War when Marxism started making an entrance into America?
I wouldn't put it like that, no. Karl Marx, of course, was writing extensively about the Civil War. Even prior to that, he had been throughout the 1850s had been writing for the New York World Tribune. He was a European correspondent for the New York World Tribune, which was the biggest newspaper in the United States. It was the newspaper of the fledgling Republican Party. So Lincoln probably read Marx undoubtedly because he was an avid reader of the Tribune. Lots of Marx's friends had emigrated from Germany after the failed 1848 revolutions, and he kept up correspondence with them. Many of them fought with the Union Army in the Civil War, and they interpreted the Civil War through a lens that was very similar to Marx's. But nobody called themselves a Marxist at that time. The sort of term Marxism as a political philosophy or ideology doesn't really start to emerge until the 1870s or really the 1880s, and Marx died in 1883, so he didn't really live to see Marxism develop.
Interesting. Now, what was it about the Civil War? Was it just the fact that this is kind of when Marx's writings were, when he was starting to gain popularity? Or was there something about the Civil War that was the right training ground for people who were interested in this kind of thing?
I mean, I think political radicals around the world, Europe and in the United States, fledgling sort of small d Democrats, and socialists are, Marx called himself a communist. It's a small c communism. He used the word socialism and communism interchangeably in the 19th century. They were all interested in the Civil War because they were deeply opposed to slavery and because they firmly believed that if a working class movement was going to take off anywhere, it probably was going to take off in the United States, which was like the nation of immigrants from Europe and all around the world. But they believed firmly, and this was central to Marx's argument, that it couldn't happen unless slavery was abolished because the working class could never organize, he believed, as long as there was something that kept the working class divided. It's like a racial line. In this case, some workers were enslaved and others were not, and he thought that they wouldn't get together and sort of increase working class power unless slavery was abolished.
Got it. So what are the tenets of Marxism that were brought in? Can you kind of walk me through the broad overview of the book?
Sure. Marx wrote a lot, and I think if you were to ask somebody what is Marxism, you would get as many answers as people you asked. The same with liberalism or conservatism. These political labels are incredibly slippery. There's no single definition necessarily. And when you're asking someone, it really depends on sort of time and perspective. But I'll tell you what I think Marxism is, which does not mean that Marxism, this is the Marxism everyone agrees with. And across U.S. history, when people in the United States embraced Marxism or tried to put Marx's ideas into use in the United States, they meant different things perhaps. But at its core, Marxism is a theory about history, and that is that the things driving history tend to be material. That is, humans and their relationship to economic production. Marx firmly believed that was like the main driving force of history, and capitalism in particular, he argued, was an economic system predicated on labor value. That is, like, the value in capitalism comes from people who work to create things. And this was the problem he saw. So in a way, Marx celebrated capitalism because it had overturned lots of older traditions like feudalism that he thought were highly oppressive. And he also celebrated capitalism because it brought lots of people together in highly productive ways. But he believed that the problem with capitalism was that it was predicated on the exploitation of the working class, in the sense that somebody works for, let's say, 10 hours, and they have to work for 10 hours because they have to sell their labor in order to survive. During that 10 hours, they might actually have only needed to work for 4 hours to create enough value for their own subsistence, but the other 6 hours is profit to the person who is paying their wages. And that's the sort of understanding of capitalism premised on the exploitation of labor that's central to Marxism.
Okay, let's talk about that a little more. But first, I want to ask, how did that? So that was his view about capitalism and labor. What did that translate to as far as action items or things that happened in the U.S.?
So the earliest Marxist parties emerged in the 1870s, the Working Men's Party of the United States, which was largely formed by German immigrants. And then you saw the emergence after that of the Socialist Labor Party in the 1880s. And then by the early 20th century, you get the Socialist Party of America with Eugene Debs as their leader. And I would argue all of them are operating on the Marxist principle that what is best for society is if the working class has more power, has political power. And the best way to obtain that is to organize both at the level of the point of production, which is when you get the formation of unions. If the working class has power over production, that's going to be a better, more democratic society because in a capitalist society, people spend so much of their time, so much of their lives at work. And if they're selling their labor under conditions of exploitation, and if they don't have sort of control over the workplace, over the sort of quality of work, then they're going to, their existence is not going to be very pleasurable. They're not going to be able to thrive. And that for Marx was not a democratic way of acting. And so that was like, that was the sort of core understanding of Marxism in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so people formed these political parties in order to both gain political power, sometimes win elections. The Socialist Party of America elected several people, including people to Congress from the state of Wisconsin. The Socialist Party had its largest membership numbers in the state of Oklahoma during the early 20th century. So the Socialist Party truly was a national party. And that was kind of, they were firmly in the belief that they needed a party and they needed to work within labor unions in order to create more working class power, as against the sort of emergence of capitalist power in the time period, which you could see take shape in the big corporations that had come to control most of the American economy during the late 19th and early 20th century.
What did he mean by the working class? Can you kind of define what that term means?
Sure. So famously in the Communist Manifesto, with which Marx mostly wrote himself, but with his longtime collaborator Frederick Engels, published in 1848, he outlines his sort of historical thoughts on capitalism, and he argued that out of the many classes from the feudalist society, people were being thrown into one of two classes: the bourgeoisie, which is famously the capitalist class. Those are the people who own the means of production, and thus those are the people who hire everyone else to work for them. And then the proletariat, that's the working class. And so the working class for Marx is simply just people who have to work for wages, work for a salary, people who have to sell their labor in order to survive, people who don't own the means of production, who don't own like land and factories and railroads, people who don't own things, so they have to work in order to survive. It doesn't really matter what they're doing, but the working class are people who have to work in order to make a living.
And why did he see that as an ill that needs to be a problem that needs to be solved?
Well, to go back to the early argument, precisely because it was a system predicated on exploitation. So he makes this case in Capital, especially Volume 1 of Capital, which was published in 1867. It's a lengthy analysis predicated on his lengthy studies of the working class factory system in England, but also on his studies of capitalism in the United States, including the Civil War. And he argued it was a system of exploitation, and that capital, the sort of logic of capital was one of expansion, expanding profits, expanding its sort of political and economic reach, to the detriment of the working class. And so he made the case that the working class, the more they worked, the more that capital accumulated, the more capitalists profited, and the less the working class thrived. So he saw it as a system of exploitation, and that humans, in order to sort of create a society that was not about exploitation, had to overcome capitalism, had to move into the next phase of history.
I'd be interested to see how he defined, and potentially how you define as well, exploitation. Because in the broad expansion of capitalism, I don't know that I would agree that because the people, the CEOs and the people in the boardroom get richer, everyone else gets poorer. I mean, if you look at I think it's over the past 50 years, according to the UN, a majority of, maybe not a majority, I don't know the exact percentage, but a large percentage of the world has moved out of poverty, according to UN standards, because of capitalism, because of the capitalist businesses that are allowed to thrive.
Yeah, I don't agree with that sort of take on UN figures. The most important aspect of people rising out of poverty across the world is China. Like, China has a billion people have risen out of poverty in China. China has adopted some aspects of market capitalism, but also the state commands the economy almost entirely. doesn't allow for the type of capital accumulation that we have in the United States and that most of the rest of the world has. But like here's the sort of like, to me, the exciting or interesting thing about Marxism. Marx firmly believed that capitalism was a dynamic and superior system to what came before it, because it was dynamic in the sense that it was transforming the world, and he thought that was a good thing because what came before it was worse. Feudalism or other forms of like serfdom, sort of traditional societies that were highly oppressive to most people.
Right.
But he also believed that in sort of capitalism was creating sort of systems of production and distribution that were bringing the world together in ways that would potentially transform society and allow for less exploitation. So what I mean by exploitation, and what Marx meant by exploitation, is that if very few people are profiting off the labor of lots of other people, it's just a technical situation in which that's a technical situation of exploitation. Now, across U.S. history, the working class did not always get poorer. And so like arguments made against Marx during the 20th century, especially by liberals who were in favor of the New Deal in the middle of the 20th century, at that time, I think correctly argued that Marx's prediction that capitalism was going to immiserate the working class or make the working class poorer, that was wrong on the face of it, because Marx did not live to see, could not have predicted the emergence of social democracy, the emergence of the type of like state supports for the working class that Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal put into place as a measure to essentially save capitalism and save American-style democracy in the face of the Great Depression and in the face of what likely would have been the emergence of fascism in the United States if he had not done that. Marx didn't live to see that. He couldn't have predicted that. And so liberals in the middle of the 20th century, who were not Marxists, they were deeply anti-communist, made the case that Marx was wrong, and that sort of American-style democracy and sort of putting limits on capitalism, which allowed the working class to actually prosper, that had proven Marx wrong, and it had proven the sort of American system right. That was the central core of their argument, and they read Marx quite intensely during this time period to make that case. But I think lots of people on the left, people like me, Marxists and otherwise, would argue that at least since the 1970s, the sort of like support system put into place by liberals during the middle of the 20th century fell apart. Liberals in the 20th century, liberal intellectuals in particular, wrote extensively about Marx in order to demonstrate that he was wrong, especially about his idea that capitalism necessarily immiserated the working class or made the working class poorer. Their great example in demonstrating that he was wrong was the United States of America, where the working class thrived in the middle of the 20th century. And they credited the New Deal. They credited like this American form of social democracy that FDR had helped usher in order to, as he saw it, and I think this was correct, save American capitalism, save American-style democracy. It's difficult to know what would have happened had FDR not sort of brought in the New Deal in order to stabilize capitalism and empower the working class. But I think it's likely the U.S. would have turned to some form of authoritarianism or fascism, much as was happening in Europe at the time in response to the Great Depression. So liberals had a great argument to make in the middle of the 20th century. The American working class, highly unionized, was thriving in the middle of the 20th century, and it did seem like Marx's ideas, at least with regards to exploitation inherent to capitalism, it did seem that they made less sense in that context. Lots of people on the left, Marxists and otherwise, and I would be included among these, would argue that at least since the 1970s or 1980s, these stabilizing forces of the New Deal have been stripped away by both Democrats and Republicans. and we've returned to a system of capitalism that is much closer to that existed in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is why some people refer to our current era as the Second New Deal. Inequality is on the rise, and sort of a lot of the conditions associated with inequality that Marx and Marxists and others decried has returned. And so that might be one of the reasons why Marxism has returned in fashion for lots of people.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so let's go back just a bit. You talked about the. I still want to nail down on the exploitation bit because I don't believe it's exploitation in the way that you're defining it. Because part of the reason for my belief there is because they choose to work at this company, and if the company was really exploiting them and not paying them fairly for their wages, they could move elsewhere. They could go elsewhere to find another organization. If you or I were at a business where they decided they wanted to pay you $10 an hour for your history expertise, you would rightly go elsewhere because that would be exploitative because you're worth a lot more than that. And so I don't think that I would agree that it is exploitative of um, employees at a company to give them a job and to offer them pay commensurate with their skill level.
Okay, yeah, so that is probably how a lot of Americans and people around the world believe. Certainly, people who think that capitalism is working well for most people. I like to tackle this historically. So, in the 19th century, this would have been the main difference between a small R Republican, like Abraham Lincoln, perhaps, who became a big R Republican, and then also a communist, a small c communist like Marx. There was a lot of overlap in the 19th century between republicanism and communism. Republicanism was kind of like the radical ideology in the United States in the 19th century, and was against the notion of arbitrary power. That is, like, they were against slavery in the sense that it didn't offer individuals the sort of like freedom to move. It was sort of an arbitrary imposition on people. And that's why the slogan of the new Republican Party in the 1850s was free labor, free men, free soil. Whereas, and so like Marx was in favor of abolishing slavery and thought that it would be an improvement for workers, black workers, if they had like free access to a free labor market in that sense.
Hmm.
He was deeply opposed to slavery, but he saw labor as more on a spectrum. So he didn't think that labor in a capitalist setting was free necessarily. It's just it wasn't you didn't have sort of like arbitrary. So you weren't enslaved, you weren't chattel. That's obviously a massive improvement. But
Right.
he saw capitalism not as an arbitrary system, but as sort of an impersonal system that nobody could really escape from. If you're a working class, you have to sell your labor in order to survive. And he sort of saw things systemically as exploitative. So you might have like a fair boss who wants to pay their workers fairly. But the system itself required that person, if they owned a factory or if they owned some sort of capital, the system required that they had to, like, in order to survive as a capitalist, they have to make a profit. And Marx believed that the sort of way in which you make profit in the sort of grand scheme of things was to better figure out ways to exploit your labor force.
Mm.
And so, like, Marx and those who are critical of capitalism as being not exactly a sort of not exactly freedom, are critical of it in the sense that, like, people don't really have a choice. If they want to survive, they have to sell their labor under these conditions of like inequality. So it's not, so a Marxist wouldn't think like agreeing to a job was like a free and equal exchange, like a contract. And that's like the biggest difference. I'm probably not going to convince you of that argument, but that would be the biggest sort of difference of understanding in terms of thinking about capitalism. Like, um, I like if my university, so I'm not oppressed. I do not feel like I'm an exploited person. But I can use my own personal example here. If my university decided to fire me, and I'm fairly well protected with tenure, but we've seen lots of tenure professors fired over the course of the history of tenure, which is not that old, and especially lately. If they decided to fire me, as a historian, I probably couldn't get a job elsewhere, at least not one that would pay me anywhere near fairly. And so, like, I'm protected right now, and I guess you might say, relative to lots of people who have to sell their labor, I'm relatively privileged, and I'm quite happy about that. It's one of the reasons why I earned a PhD. But if I didn't have this tenure protected job, I would be out there in conditions that, like, it probably would be impossible for me to make a living as a historian. So then I'd be sort of subject to, like, what am I going to do? What else am I skilled to do? Well, in grad school, I attended bar. So I guess I could do that, but like, and I might have to, because I have a family, I have children, I have to raise.
Right.
I guess most people who aren't PhDs and don't have tenure like I do, they just don't work under the same sort of, like, conditions, and like, most people have to sell their labor under conditions that are less than desirable. And so, like, this is one of the reasons why Marxism has remained relevant for lots of Americans across the history of American capitalism. So, like, Americans at a philosophical and at a personal level have long been obsessed with the concept of freedom, probably more than any other national history. And there's like a rich tradition of thought about freedom in the American context. And it's one of the reasons I was attracted to intellectual history, is because there is this rich history there. But one aspect that the American traditions, for the most part, have kind of ignored or missed out on is something that it's a gap that Marx fills and Marxism fills, and that is, like, so in a capitalist society, we spend so much of our time at work, like we have to, and we're not really free at work. Like, when you're at work, you don't have free speech rights, most people. When you're at work, you don't have free mobility rights. Like, in the United States, because employment is often connected to or conditioned to health insurance, you don't actually have free mobility, because, like, oftentimes leaving your job means losing health insurance. This is an aspect that of, like, freedom, like enhancing freedom, that most American political and intellectual traditions kind of ignore. It's one reason why C. Wright Mills, who was this great 20th century intellectual, it's one reason why he argued that Marx actually extended 19th century liberalism to the working class. He was more liberal than liberals.
Hmm. Yeah, the freedom thing is interesting, because I think that oftentimes people mistake safety. Well, they want safety and freedom. I don't know that you can have both of those together. If you are free, then you are also, if you're free to start your own business, do whatever you want, you're also free to accidentally crash and burn. And if you're safe, then you're not. If you're safe, you're strapped into your car seat, then you're not free. So I think that those two, safety and freedom, often stand at juxtaposition, but I think that both are necessary. And I would disagree with the free speech part on the that you mentioned, that people don't have freedom of speech where they work. If that is the case, I would recommend that they leave that job and go find somewhere else they can work, because I think that the magic of um, the magic of capitalism is because it's run by individuals and not by a government who um, mandates that these are the free speech codes that you must follow, or these are the other laws that you must abide by. If I don't like working for this person, I can go work for this person over here, and this person over here might be much more reasonable. They might agree with the things that I'm saying, and they might want to, pay me. It may end up being that they pay me less over here, but it's something that I enjoy, a place that I enjoy working at, and so I don't know that I would agree that that is. I think freedom and safety are. Um, you can't have all freedom and all safety.
Is this an argument against seatbelts? No, I'm kidding. I mean, so the sort of Marxist conception of freedom, and this is also a social democratic conception of freedom that FDR elaborated on in the middle of the 20th century, is that you can't actually have freedom without some degree of security. Like if people don't have economic security, it's really hard to imagine that they have freedom or the ability to obtain conditions under which they can flourish. Freedom is
Right.
like freedom from my perspective is like somebody who has conditions under which they can flourish. And I just don't believe that people have the sort of ability, or like everybody has the ability to sort of find and create their own conditions to flourish. The conditions to flourish is a social thing. It's a societal thing. It's not something that individuals can create for themselves, or most individuals. A few lucky ones, of course, can. And it's usually the few lucky ones who sort of are like become representative of society in ways that I think are deeply ideological, but most people cannot create their own conditions for flourishment. These are sort of like embedded in our society.
What do you mean by flourishment in that sense?
I have a very Marxist sense of flourishment. Like Marx believed that everybody can offer something unique to everybody can offer something unique to society. Everybody is an individual, but that the conditions for offering that unique thing, like our unique talents, who we are as individuals, is deeply, deeply constrained by various historical patterns and structures. And so his whole life mission was to sort of think through history in ways that we as humans might come together and organize our way out of these patterns of exploitation, like a pattern of social norms that are exploitative. Um, like Marx is often misunderstood, I think, by lots of people, conservatives, liberals, like anyone who I think has not really grappled with Marx in serious and sustained fashion is often assumed like he's anti-individual. I consider him one of the great philosophers of individualism of the 19th
Hmm.
century, because he firmly believed that individuals were unique and uniquely capable and could offer something, but that the sort of conditions for individualism were part of a larger sort of like social fabric. And so the social fabric has to improve if individuals can flourish, can be free to be their full selves.
I would agree that the social fabric needs to change. I don't think that what we have going for us right now is optimal. I think that in many ways, I'm sure you've seen the graph of the um, rent prices or house prices, and then the going up steeply and wages remaining somewhat the same. But I would actually tie a lot of this. Um, I don't know if I would use the word exploitation, but a lot of the economic problems to an overreach in government as opposed to innately systemic in capitalism.
Yeah, okay. I can't agree with that. I mean, I think we do have an overreaching government, absolutely. And like since I just wrote a book on Marx, I will return to Marx, and Marx saw the state or the government as inherently serving the interests of capitalism. Our government absolutely serves capitalism. Not exact, maybe not in the way that you want it to. Um, and
What do you mean by serves capitalism?
the state represents the interests of capitalism, just like it's pretty straightforward. Now there are different sort of vested capitalist interests. So the Democratic Party is much more interested in like one version of capitalism than the current Republican Party, but both of them represent some version of capitalism, and this has always been the case in the U.S., at least going back to the 1880s. And so, like, when the two parties are in disagreement about something, it's two different versions of capitalism and how the state should best represent capitalism. The U.S. has never had a party, a political party, or a political system that has represented the interests of working people. And so, like, most of us are just sort of struggling over crumbs, and debating oftentimes violently, sort of like a political system that serves very few of us. So like, why why have wages not kept up with the sort of like rising prices? You might say it's a complex, there's a sort of like complex answer to that, but wages have been suppressed since the 1970s as the government has implemented policies that have benefited large corporations, such as easing laws beginning in the 1970s to allow corporations to move labor forces overseas. In the 1980s, beginning with Ronald Reagan crushing the Air Traffic Controllers Union, the government has made it increasingly difficult for workers to organize. Organized labor was the main sort of fulcrum of what we like to consider the middle class in the 20th century United States. That's the main reason for the rise in wages relative to wealth in the 20th century, and also the main reason for the stability of the whole capitalist system in the middle of the 20th century after the Great Depression, had a lot to do with the high density of unionization, which created stability for large numbers of working Americans. All of that is eroding, and so wages are being sort of tamped down, which has created a great deal of inequality. It's not only created inequality, it's built a lot of instability into the system. And, the government has helped all along the way.
Yeah, I think the way that I think you and I would both agree that the government needs some adjustments and some fixing. I don't know that we would agree on exactly what that looks like, but I do think that the part of the reason why we've seen that problem is because of the vast increases in taxes that are stripping away from the from average people's paycheck, and not enabling them to be free with their money.
So
Would you disagree there?
the way in which we're taxed is highly problematic. So, like, for example, in the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower, Republican and war hero general, was president, the marginal tax rate was 90%. The marginal tax rate, of course, I'm sure your listeners know, is that which people are taxed above a certain income. Usually for a family income, it would be $250,000. So there's one rate for everything you earn up to $250,000. And then after that, you're taxed at a marginal rate, a different rate. In the 1950s, it was 90%. And that created a lot of stability for the system. It allowed a government to fund itself for things it needed to do, like build highways. But it also ensured that there wouldn't be runaway inequality and all the problems that come with that I think we're now experiencing. So now, yeah, like people, I can't speak to your income, but people like us, I would imagine, pay a lot in taxes, and it can be really frustrating, and it's like a nickel and dime system, right? Because you're getting taxed at all these different levels that seem oftentimes unfair, and I understand why people are angry about it, and I understand, like, for example, why in the 1970s California created a law that said you could only increase state taxes by vote, right? There's a referendum. There's like a taxpayer revolt in the 1970s as people are trying to claw back their income. But the marginal tax rate right now is about 24%. So, like, the rich are not getting taxed anywhere near, like nowhere near where they were when the United States economy was operating with stability and was actually fair to most people. So I don't, like, I don't want to be taxed more. I don't want you to be taxed more. I assume you're not a billionaire.
Well, I assume that too.
I'm not. I would never make the case for us to be taxed more. I think we're taxed plenty. But
Yes.
I would love Elon Musk to be taxed much more. I would love Bill Gates to be taxed more, et cetera, et cetera. They're not taxed in any sort of any reasonable society. Would tax people who benefit more from that society. And if they're not benefiting from our society, then no one is. And I don't think we benefit from them. We certainly don't benefit from their ability to shape our political and media culture. Like, we certainly don't benefit from that.
Oh, you're back.
Yeah, sorry. This is capitalism. I'm blaming capitalism for my poor Wi-Fi.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. So, well, I just looked up the statistics on what the top 1% of income earners in the U.S. provided as far as tax revenue, and it looks like they provided 40% of tax revenue in 2022. So they are paying some taxes, but they're paying a lot of taxes, and I have relatives who would be considered in that top 1%, and they percentage wise pay much more taxes than I do. So I would argue that there's a problem. There's a broad problem with the tax structure already in the tax system that we have. I think taxes need to be reduced across the board, and I actually think that would be less exploitative of the people who are making the most money, who are being charged the most in taxes.
So, like, those figures are about income. And yeah, so, like, people who earn a lot of money are still paying a lot in taxes. I don't think an unfair amount, because they're doing fine. And I certainly don't consider that exploitation of the same level of somebody who's, like, earning minimum wage. But what I mean by the marginal income tax is, like, it's just not high enough. And one of the reasons why the top 1% are still paying a large percentage of the overall tax base is because they've been allowed to accumulate such huge incomes. But what I mean by, like, here's where we need to tax things. It's like capital accumulation that doesn't fall under income. It's corporate taxes. Like, corporations do not really pay that much in taxes, and yet as entities are allowed to sort of accumulate so much wealth and capital that individual shareholders can take from them, and we don't really tax shares of corporations or on the stock market in the way that I think we should. I just think we have this is, like, there are many sort of historical reasons for this, but I think many of us in the United States have a sort of distorted picture of what taxation does. Do many of us maybe feel like we're unfairly taxed? Of course. But, I spent a year living in Denmark, which is a capitalist nation, but they have the sort of, like, social stability put into place that FDR and the New Deal tried to put into place, and to some degree did in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, they pay much higher taxes than we do. I would say they're not nickel and dimed the way we are, but they pay a much higher percentage of their income in taxes. You don't get nearly as many people, Danes, people in Denmark, complaining about taxes because they see the value in it. And I think one of the problems with us being
Mm.
taxed is we don't see the value in our taxation. I mean, our infrastructure is crumbling. You
Mm.
know, like most people I know are deeply, deeply opposed to um, our defense budget, and so like we don't understand. We don't either don't understand or we're deeply sort of opposed to the things that our taxes are going towards. Whereas our infrastructure is crumbling, you know, we don't fund schools the way we should. I feel like if we had a society that where working class people had more power, and thus where the government was more responsive to the needs of most people, I think more people, not the rich, but more people would be happy to pay a fair share in taxes and wouldn't feel like taxation was exploitation because they would recognize the benefits of a government that served their interests. We just don't have a government that serves most people's interests, and we haven't for a long time.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if we paid taxes and our roads got better,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
our our water cisterns got cleaner.
yeah.
That would be wonderful. But I think the wonderful thing about America is someone from the lowest economic ladder can climb to the top, um, and that's not possible if you split everyone into here are your here's the proletariat, the working class, and then the bourgeoisie, and you're kind of stuck there. And we'll try and raise the whole system up, but I just think that takes significantly more effort, and there will be people who just exploit that, and
Well,
take what they can from that.
so let's compare the United States now. I agree that there was a time period when social mobility was greater in the United States than say in Europe, and why so many Europeans came to the United States. And one of the reasons, only one of the reasons, was in part for that sort of like for that rationale.
Hmm.
But social mobility is much greater in like Northern Europe than it is in the United States right now. And I think it has a lot to do with the sort of like, I keep going back to this, but the sort, and this isn't a Marxist argument. This is just a basic sort of like 20th century liberal argument. The sort of forms of stability put into place in a Scandinavian nation. So, like for example, if you want to improve yourself in Denmark and you want to like go to med school, the state pays for it. So the collective pays for it. There is social mobility there for people who are willing to work hard and sort of, I guess, take years out of their life to go to med school. Um,
Yeah.
that does, you know, like nothing like that exists in the United States, and it's one of the reasons why fewer people are becoming doctors. Like that in our, excuse my French, fucked up health insurance industry. It's just uh, there just aren't the same incentives in the United States as there once were, and there certainly aren't the same incentives in the United States that there are in lots of European countries now, where social mobility is actually greater.
Hmm. I'd be interested to see where you're. I don't know if you have a study or anything like that that shows you that. I've I know some people over in Europe, and I think they would maybe disagree with that fact. Um, but I do want to touch on the point you mentioned. I think you're wise to look at incentives, and try and make sure that we're keeping incentives in mind. I think that if you take someone who wants to take years out of their life, spend a lot of time and energy and money, and work very, very hard, and then they get a medical degree, they become a doctor. I think they should be rewarded for the amount of time and energy and the skills and expertise they've accumulated. But not only that, and I think I would agree with you that the healthcare system is a problem. But not only that, but if you take the same time, energy, money, um, stress, hard work, all of it, and put it into starting a business, then and that creates a ton of value for a lot of people. You're also going to receive monetary outcomes commensurate with the amount of work that you have put in and the amount of well, not the amount of work, but the amount of value that you have created for your customers and for the people who invested in your company.
Yeah, that's an idyllic view.
But
So
that's I mean that's what has made America great is people doing just that, right?
no, I mean, small businesses, like, we tend to sort of frame our sort of understanding of the United States right now and our economy around the sort of like small business person, the entrepreneur. But that just doesn't, that's not what most people are. Most people either work for large corporations or large institutions, and that's where our economy is, that's where our society is. Um, you know, I don't know. I don't know what to say. I just don't believe
Yeah.
in this sort of like plucky entrepreneur. I think it's a fable. I don't think it really describes our society. I think human beings have lots of incentives. Some are economic, of course. We have to survive and thrive, and we want to thrive. But lots of our incentives are not economic. And like, if somebody wants to be a doctor, some of that, and we need more and better doctors, some of it might be an economic incentive. A doctor, I think, certainly should live a good and comfortable life, like lots of people should. But like they might want to help people as well.
That's generally the incentive for a lot of doctors is they start up. And you say this the same thing with lawyers and lots of people who make high salary incomes is they actually just want to provide value to people. And if entrepreneurs get into business going, I just want to make the most amount of money, they're going to start a B2B SaaS software company in San Francisco, and then they're going to sell it after 5 years.
There are other types of incentives beyond the economic type, and that like
Yeah, yeah.
somebody who wants to be a doctor, there's a good chance one of their incentives is like to help people, or maybe their incentives are also because they're really interested in like science and the human body. I don't know. There's lots of
Yeah,
different
yeah.
sort of reasons. Like I didn't become a historian to become rich. I know that's going to shock you.
Well, I
I
didn't
didn't
get
write a
into
book
this to
about,
get rich either, so
yeah. Like
we're
there's
we're
like
both in the
actual,
same boat there.
we're trying to flourish as individuals in the way that Marx hoped we would.
Yeah. Well, well, I don't know if yeah, I don't know if that's true because I, as a Christian, I see part of our flourishing as having lots to do and doing lots of work. And so I don't know that that would that lines up with what Marx is saying. But I do agree that a lot of the times, in fact, most of the time, if not all of the time, the incentive structure for people who are trying to go out on a limb and take a risk and do something um, really exceptionally difficult, like going to medical school or passing the bar, or I would and starting a business, putting a lot of time, energy, and money into that. The incentive structure is I have a problem that people have, and I want to provide a solution and bless them and bring value to them. And if you look at like take Jeff Bezos, I don't know what his incentives were inside his head, but whatever the case, whatever his incentives were, it ended up being the case that now you can shop for things online. I can get things shipped across the globe for me at pennies on the dollar. I can I could buy your book, Karl Marx in America, from Amazon and have it delivered to me on Friday or whatever it is. And that's something that, his incentives in his head might have been, I really want to just make a ton of money. I would say it's somewhat unlikely, but that's possible. But he did provide an extraordinary amount of value, and that's why he's gotten an extraordinary amount of money on the back end.
So I'm not gonna like fully disagree with you. I would just make the case, and I have no idea why Bezos did what he did, and that really doesn't. I don't really care. Um, what I would argue is like nobody, given the types of instability that having a few people with so much wealth, I think, creates for our society. Nobody needs to be a multi-billionaire. So I would be fine, I guess, to some extent with somebody like Bezos being wealthy and living this great life and, like sailing around the world on their yacht with their plastic surgery and everything. I'd be good with that,
Yeah.
whatever. I don't care. I don't judge people. But I would like some of that. I don't think he earned all billions and billions of dollars. Like nobody earns that, and so I'd be happy with some of that being taxed, or rather, him not having earned it on the backs of Amazon truck drivers who are unable to unionize, unable to take breaks to take a piss. Like the conditions of employment for an Amazon delivery truck driver are pretty horrendous.
Right.
I think that we should have a government that allows and ensures that those people can unionize no matter what Bezos thinks or wants, and that they can create better working conditions for themselves. That's, like then Bezos can create the system that allows us to get great books delivered to our doorstep in a day or two.
Yeah. And I don't think that where I would disagree is that I don't think that if the government steps in and tries to fix this problem on its own, I think it's actually going to cause more problems. And part of the reason I say that is because if you look at the history of pretty much any government, as soon as they try and step in and solve a very small problem, um, uh, you know, the largest government, the federal government, tries to step in and solve a small problem, it generally ends. It generally ends in. It doesn't end well. It doesn't. They
So,
don't solve the problem
so would
effectively.
would you have, like, let's say you were around as your current self in 1935, would you have opposed the National Labor Relation Act, which for the first time in U.S. history made the federal government a neutral arbiter and made it legal for workers to collectively organize for a union? Because that is like the condition for the growth of unions in the 20th century, which what I would argue is like probably one of the best things to happen in U.S. history. Um, like if we still had a strong and robust National Labor Relations Act, if we still had a federal government that protected labor rights to the degree that it used to, Amazon workers would have much better conditions. Bezos would still be rich. He'd still be on his yacht, but he wouldn't have whatever he has now, $200 billion. And
Yeah,
more importantly, the people who work for him would not have to piss in bottles.
that yes, I agree with the last part, but I don't. I maybe it's I just don't know enough, but I don't understand. If you were an Amazon delivery driver, and that was your working condition, couldn't you? I mean, couldn't you just quit?
So
Like there are other places that are looking for drivers. Are one of the most high demand peoples in the country right now.
I mean, Amazon has effectively created a monopoly on the delivery of goods and services. So, I mean, I guess you could be like a gig driver and work for Uber, but
But
those conditions aren't like that much better, and it's not a sort of condition of economic stability that you would hope to get by sort of working for a big corporation like Amazon.
yeah, no,
So you're
yeah.
not in favor of unionization, is that what you're saying?
I don't think I am. I'm afraid I haven't done as much research on unions as I should have. But I full transparency. I don't know. But I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Okay.
But I don't see Jeff Bezos having $200 billion as a problem. Um, unless he stole it from a lot of people. And I don't think that he did. I think that the reason he has $200 billion is because he has provided much more than that in value for people across the globe. And so I think that a lot of a lot of Marxism can be boiled down to just envy. And I don't like that that person has vast gobs of money, shocking amounts of money. And
So I hate to disappoint you, but
I
I don't
don't.
like I don't I hate to disappoint you, Jackson, but I don't have like an
Okay.
ounce of envy in me. There's nothing about Bezos's life that I want, and most of the people I know don't want his life. But rather, we recognize that when some people control that much wealth, they also have that much political and cultural power, and that's an incredibly unstable and unhealthy thing for any society that to go back to my original argument, any society that hopes to sort of create the conditions for the vast majority of people to flourish, to find their true selves, to be able to sort of contribute to society how they want to. I think that kind of economic inequality, that kind of like wealth control is just inherently unhealthy and destabilizing, and nothing good will come of it, and nothing good has come of it. I'm not saying nothing good has come of like Amazon the entity. I'm saying nothing good has or will come of some people having control of so much of the resources in society.
But I don't know that I would agree with that either, because Jeff Bezos, out of his $200 billion, and you look at Elon Musk, he's doing the same thing. They're building rockets to go to Mars and to go to the moon and to be able to deliver satellites into orbit much more efficiently and at a lower cost. And that is only because they had the extraordinary amount of capital necessary to start a fund such as SpaceX or Blue Origin. And I would see that as actually a real good thing.
Yeah, not me. I just feel like there's so much better use of resources when we have so many problems. Like
Yeah,
let's go back to our roads. I mean,
yeah.
why are the roads crumbling? Why do we not have a good public transportation system? Why do we have dangerous, unclean water in several cities in this country? Why do we have schools that are in many cities overcrowded? Like point to any social ill, and I think like economic redistribution would be the solution to those ills. And I know exactly where to go for the wealth to redistribute. There are some people who are sending themselves to Mars while others are starving. I just think that's an unhealthy, irrational society.
Yeah. Um,
And here I said we weren't going to
yes.
debate.
Yes. No, I would agree. But yeah, here's what I'll say is if you look at someone like Bill Gates, the amount of wealth he has created and then that he has used through the Bill and Melinda Foundation has saved millions and millions, perhaps billions of people from dying through the various things that he's done. And that is, again, only because he has an extraordinary amount of money that he can do that with. And I think if you look at the incentives, and if Elon Musk were to instead of SpaceX, put his money towards roads and cleaner water and things like that, the incentive would be for him to, like he does, that's not his problem. And so the incentive would be, okay, now there's toll roads and now you have to pay uh, more for water or whatever it is. And I think that's the same thing for government. If we give the government this extraordinary amount of money and say you need to distribute this evenly, their incentive is going to be to keep back some more for themselves, which is I think why you see so many in communist countries around the world, the government becomes larger and the people in government become much more wealthy, while the people at the who the money was supposed to be redistributed to don't actually see a radical rise. In fact, they generally see a decline in average life, quality of life.
There's a lot there, Jackson. I don't know. We're definitely not going to agree on most things.
No, no, we're not. Yeah, I think we'll wrap it up there. I'm sure we could keep going for forever, but where can people find you and Karl Marx in America online for them to read the book and make their decisions for themselves?
Well, have you heard of this little website called Amazon? But
There you go.
for those of you who want to avoid the behemoth known as Amazon, you can also buy my book on the University of Chicago website.
Oh, okay, wonderful. And you have a Twitter following, correct?
Mm-hmm. Chill Kami.
Chilkami. That's where you'll find him. Andrew Hartman, thank you so much for joining me. It has
Thanks
been
so
a
much,
real pleasure
Jackson.
talking to you.
It's been fun.
See you guys.